So, last month, Doom Eternal and Animal Crossing were both released. I played both of those games quite a bit, and I enjoyed both of those games a lot, but I felt like both of those games were overshadowed a little bit by the releases of Resident Evil 3 Remake and Final Fantasy VII Remake. And the year before that, people were really upset that Resident Evil 2 Remake didn't win Game of the Year. And it's been my personal opinion that remakes and remasters really shouldn't be in the running for Game of the Year. I mean, they're thriving off the success of an older game, but a lot of people have been making the argument that these remakes are different enough from their originals to warrant inclusion in the Game of the Year discussion. And that really got me thinking. I think we need to call these games something other than remakes. So, as it has been my understanding, there are several different kinds of releases when it comes to games. You have the initial release, that is a game that is the base release for all the other types of releases. There might be a special edition or a Game of the Year release, but these releases are the same. They're the initial release. They might just have some extra DLC or different packaging or something, but at its simplest form, these are a new game. These are the games as is, and nothing else. And then you have a port, which is probably the other most common release, which is bringing a game to a new console that it was not previously on. There might be some subtle changes like music and graphic quality, but at its core it's the same game, just on a different system. An example of that would be Doom, which originally came on PC and has since been ported onto literally every console known to man. Or a most recent example, Nintendo porting a bunch of its 3DS and Wii U games onto the Switch. Now this is when things start to get a little confusing. We have remasters. Now, as I have always defined remasters, is that they're the same game as the original release, but are made to perform better and look better on modern hardware. Maybe the game has been upscaled to a better resolution, it's been designed to work on an HD TV instead of needing a CRT, maybe some bugs or balancing issues were fixed, but at its core it's still the same game with the same graphical style running on the same or a similar engine. Remasters were really big in the PS3 era, and some of those examples for remasters would be the Shadow of the Colossus remaster, the God of War remasters, the Devil May Cry remasters, and, of course, the Kingdom Hearts remasters. And then we have reboots, which are completely separate from the original game, but they're often brought up in this conversation with remasters and remakes. Reboots typically have similar characters, similar gameplay mechanics, or story motifs, but they usually follow a different story and aren't really directly related to the original release at all. Some famous reboots are like DMC, Devil May Cry, and the Tomb Raider reboots. They feature similar themes and gameplay to their original counterparts, but have little to do with them in terms of story, world, canon, or continuity outside of the main characters' names. And then we have remakes. Remakes, to me, were rebuildings of old games with new graphics, new engines, and maybe even new controls, essentially bringing an older game into a modern age with some quality of life improvements. Remakes don't really change the game from a story or gameplay perspective, they just update them. And for the longest time, they weren't really looked at as a brand new game. The stories and gameplay were intact even if the cutscenes were improved and gameplay mechanics were streamlined. Some examples of remakes to me were the Metal Gear Solid Twin Snakes, Kirby's Nightmare on Dreamland, the original Resident Evil remake, and a little more recently the Shadow of the Colossus, Spyro, and Crash Bandicoot remakes, and from the look of it, the upcoming Destroy All Humans remake. But those very basic definitions are often confused. Let's take a look at DuckTales, for example. It's billed as a remaster, but everything about it really is more of a remake. It features a new engine, a new art style, new music, voice acting, etc., and yet maintains the gameplay of the original game. According to its definition, it's really more of a remake than a simple remaster. Well, then a remaster has to be defined to account for gameplay changes, I might hear you say. Well then let's take a look at Shadow of the Colossus, Spyro, and Crash Bandicoot, which are all billed as remakes. They are games completely rebuilt from the ground up. They feature new engines, completely new art directions, new sound effects, and yet they still have the same gameplay and level design. By definition, with a lack of gameplay change, they should be considered remasters. Yet everyone considers them remakes because they were remade from the ground up and simply don't build off the original's build, which is also what DuckTales does. They are pure and true remakes because the stories, gameplay, and worlds are completely unedited from their original counterparts. The Halo Anniversary and Halo 2 on the Master Chief Collection are remakes as well. They were built from the ground up with a new engine, new lighting, new graphics. As a quick side note, Halo 2's remake is still one of the best looking games I've ever seen. Holy shit, that game looks good. And yet, the gameplay and story are so intact and unedited that they offer you the ability to switch back and forth between the originals with the point of a button while you're playing. Warcraft 3 Reforged is sold as a remake. My personal opinions aside, I think it's more of a remaster as well. It's on the same engine as the original game and features the same gameplay with some slightly edited maps, and features some more detailed textures. The definitions of remaster and remake are getting more and more confusing and confused. And reboots aren't excluded from that discussion as well. Mortal Kombat 9 is billed as a reboot. They dropped the number title and basically treat it as the first in a rebooted series. And yet, the first 8 games are still considered canon, and the 2 games after, X or 10 and 11, are not titled as 2 or 3, which would be indicative of that of a rebooted series. So 9 is actually a sequel, not a reboot. The same goes for Doom 2016 and God of War 2018. All the previous games are canon, they're just new games in the series, not reboots, they're sequels. Yet their titles and marketing would suggest that they're rebooted franchise separate from their original releases. And now we're on to this new wave of remakes. Final Fantasy VII Remake and the new Resident Evil remakes go beyond what something like Kirby's Nightmare and Dreamland did, or the Crash and Spyro remakes did, or even what the first Resident Evil remake did. Sure, they might be retelling the core story of their original counterparts, but the art direction, gameplay, graphics, story specifics, even genre are different from their original counterparts. They add story elements, take away story elements, they change story elements to where you could argue that they really aren't remakes, they're kind of their own games. But the fact that the general setting, the general main story, and the characters are all the same also lend to it being a remake. It's really confusing. Another, less recent example is Ratchet & Clank. What the hell do you call this game? It's a remake because it retells the story of the first Ratchet & Clank, but they also change a lot and take away a lot from the original too. But it's also a movie tie-in, the movie being an adaptation of the original game. So it's a game that's a remake that's simultaneously an adaptation of a movie adaptation. What the hell? I propose that we redefine the naming conventions. They need to be a little bit more clear as to what these games really are. So my new conventions are the original game. This is simply the game as originally released. Whether that includes special editions or Game of the Year editions, they're all under that same umbrella as the original game. Ports would also be considered that. They're just the same game being added to another console. Then we have a remaster. Remasters are the same game as the original, but they feature bug fixes, higher resolutions, maybe some fixes to control, and are easier to play on modern consoles. Then we have reboots, which are completely separate from the original series, but they might feature similar motifs, settings, or characters, and similar gameplay, but they're not sequels and not part of the mainline story. Remakes are games that are built from the ground up, featuring a new engine, new graphics, new art style, maybe some new controls, etc., but they feature the same story and same gameplay as their original releases. And finally, what the purpose of this video is, I propose that we start calling the new wave of remakes requels, which are a new game built from the ground up with a similar story, setting, and characters to the original game, but with significant changes, additions, and subtractions to or from a game's story or gameplay, often resulting in the game becoming its own thing. So yeah, I'm taking a note from the Evil Dead playbook, I'm calling these things requels. They really aren't true remakes, but they aren't detached enough to be sequels, and they aren't detached enough to be their own things. There's something else, and there's something new. They are the requel.